How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? Seth Julian here from Traders Brief, bringing you Traders Sino American Rivalry Brief. I'd like to welcome you to Trade On 2020 today. This is always a big event, and we're happy to be here. Um, Today, we're going to talk about the rivalry that's taking place between the first and second greatest economic powers of the day, the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, or the People's Republic of China. And, excuse me, we're going to focus on some recent Chinese American background, a little history, so we get a sense of what we're talking about. Then we're going to talk about the assets in play. It's principally a foreign exchange proposition. We're talking about Hong Kong dollar, US dollar, Japanese yen, Aussie dollar, Chinese yuan, obviously, and then we're going to finally look at a little bit of probability and what we think is the likelihood in the near term for the movement in these assets. So let us begin, and feel free, of course, to ask any questions you care to here. We'll try to take them in real time and answer them as we go along. Now, Chinese dominance in world affairs is not new. The Han people, which is the native Chinese strain of genetic strain, along with others at different times, have been at the leading edge of innovation and expansive relations for much of world history. Now, the 19th and the 20th centuries were not kind to the Chinese. However, the end of the 20th and throughout the 21st century, China has made unprecedented advances towards its former glories. I mean, this is an ancient Tibetan compass, also a Chinese magnetic compass device. This is a solar calendar and clock arrangement. This is one of the giant Chinese junks that used to apply the seas between the South China Sea and Africa, the East African coast. Of course, the ubiquitous Chinese abacus, and among many, many, many more other innovations. Gunpowder, that's not even here at all. There's currently a deep and vigorous rivalry between the current dominant force in world affairs and the contender for the title, of course. That's the United States and China, respectively. The United States, since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and that's used as a shorthand reference to the decline of the only other superpower that existed in the world during the Cold War, from the end of the Second World War in 1945 to as we say, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is the effective breakup of the Soviet Union in 1989, had, until this new administration came to power, been the champion of the Westphalian system of international relations. And simply stated, the Treaty of Westphalia goes back to 1654, and it's, in its essence, it provides for rules-based relationships between national sovereignties. It's a fundamental touchstone document in international relations, and serves, more or less in the breach or in full, depending on what period of time we're speaking of, as the basis for modern international political and economic and strategic relations between sovereign nations. By 1972, China is well on its way to becoming a major power in the world. The U.S. President Richard Nixon meets Chinese Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong, and that's this gentleman here, if you didn't notice, and of course that's Richard Nixon on the right, and establishes, and later, a couple of years later, actually, establishes formal diplomatic relations with the Communist Party-run state, and that was the first time that had happened. The Americans were allies of the Chinese nationalists, the Kuomintang, under Chiang Kai-shek during the Second World War to fight the Japanese, and the Chinese communists participated in that endeavor as well. But once the war is over, in 1949, the Chinese communists overthrow the nationalists and run them off to the island of Taiwan, which is where they are to this day, and have no true intention of ever becoming a Chinese vassal state. The nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek were a free market democratic society as Taiwan is today, and which of course China is quite far from. Um, Now, by the late 1970s, Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, this demure fellow here with the white socks, crafts the policy of free market capitalism run by one party state rule. The evolution of this unique political economic policy has been successful and rapid beyond anything Deng could have imagined. What Deng basically does is free the ancient and deeply respected, well-known and deeply respected Chinese acumen for business and making profit. He set that free while maintaining one-party rule, rigid one-party rule by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, by the early 2010s, this is the second decade of the 21st century, which we're at the end of the second decade now. No, I'm sorry, the end of the second century, decade rather. The Chinese economy, surpasses Japan to become the world's second largest economy. Now, think of that. In my lifetime, I grew up with this gentleman, Mao Zedong, and you'll notice him wearing the ever humble and ever present Mao suit. When I was young, I'm 62 years old now. Everybody in China, there were only four outfits. There was the Mao suit in gray, the Mao suit in black, the Mao suit in beige, and the Mao suit in blue. And that was it. Most people, 98% of the crowd, wore black. And they had the same bike and the same haircut and the same shoes. And it was always considered a marvel that they could make their own shoelaces because they needed 800 zillion pairs every 15 minutes because their population was so enormous. But anyway, they do become the second largest economy by the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century. And this rapid rise to economic prominence was achieved mostly because China opened up her own large, low-cost pool of skilled labor to lure in manufacturers and hoped for a large market, a domestic market, the manufacturers hoped for a large domestic market that would consume some of its manufactured products. And therein perhaps lies the haughtiness or the greed of the major Western corporations that established themselves in China because they couldn't really resist. Capitalists are well known to be accused of selling you the rope that you hang them with. That's sort of their nature, if you get the picture. And we'll get to the capitulation in a moment of these Western capitalist businesses. But as the economy of China grew, the terms of trade it was offering to partners, in other words, corporations that wanted to set up in China and do business, were increasingly in its own Chinese favor. In other words, they bent the rules to suit their purposes. The most irksome part of which was the demand that firms operating in China turn over their technology to their Chinese partners. Now, I guess as an aside, but it's actually right to this point. Let's not pretend that the United States doesn't play the same game, or certainly the EU with their mountains, their daily effluvium of endless regulation and codification. They do. There's no doubt about that. But the Chinese were seen to be, perhaps by the dominant power, who would naturally look down at the upstart, but was seen to be deeply manipulative and unrespectful of a common set of protocols or rules of behavior to play, rules of the game, as it were. So the Chinese have we have to also be clear about the fact that the Chinese have a well-deserved reputation for being highly determined and aggressive business people. The potential for profits held out by this enormous market, that is to say, serving the domestic China. If you're Buick and you want to produce in China, you're not really looking to produce large, heavy vehicles that cost a lot of money to ship back to the to European or American markets. You're really looking to produce to hopefully create and then later satisfy a demand for those cars in the domestic market. So the potential for profits held out by this enormous market were irresistible. to large Western firms, and so they capitulated to the CCP, that's the Chinese Communist Party, demands that, look, there's plenty of demands. All nations have their own demands. 51% of the shares have to be held by the local partner. That's well known and probably exists in most countries. You have to agree to employ a certain percentage or a maximum percentage of your own nationals in favor of, in preference of the local nationals, in this case the Chinese. Oftentimes, depending on the nature of the operation being established, large and lavish tax benefits or tax abatements are provided by the local authority to entice the corporate player to establish at a particular location in the host country. And well, it's just it's a it's a sophisticated game played by both parties, and we have to be careful not to paint the Chinese as invariably or uniquely, I should say, guilty of a violation of the norms of the game. All sides violate the norms. It's mostly, unfortunately, comes down to a question of who's got the upper hand in the perception of regulators or market traders, or in our case, we're interested in market traders. And so we're going to get to that in a moment, but let's just finish our background discussion. From the early 2020s until the arrival of COVID-19, the Chinese economy grew at an average of 6% a year. Now, admittedly, precision of government statistics is a loose notion for the CCP. Nonetheless, the huge growth was there to be seen in order to feed this development. And you saw this, I mean, if you ever watch National Geographic or even just any sort of news outlet from China or about China, they would talk about these cities that were put up in no time, 5 years, from a barren stretch of land to a complete and total city with schools and hospitals and clinics and factory areas and industrial zones and transportation systems and housing and commercial centers. Unbelievable what they could do when they marshaled the resources they have. And remember, this is what we're talking about, and this is really the underlying theme here. Their approach to the organization of a particular society, or certainly Chinese society, is a what we call it. We used to call it in the old communist era, the Cold War era, a command economy. Now, the Chinese are quite far from having a command economy in the sense of the old Soviet model or the old Maoist model. But leave us make no mistake, this is no free market capitalism. This is, as the Chinese like to say, capitalism with a Chinese communist face. And, well, that says it all, doesn't it? It's a particular version of capitalism which is not free and unrestrained, does not engender or certainly encourage or even come with the expectation of any sort of freedom of political expression. It's a one-party state, and you better toe the line. And just ask any Uyghur in northwestern China whether how much freedom they're experiencing at the hands of the CCP. But well, I digress. But the idea here is that that statist model, where the one-party state can command, because there is no free market, there is no freedom of expression or choice in a society like modern-day communist China, that they can marshal tremendous resources that might not be attracted to a similar proposition in the freer market arrangement. In other words, if somebody proposed building some enormous hydroelectric power plant somewhere, and I don't know, nobody was really jumping at this opportunity, in which case normally the government would do it. But in America, the government hasn't really done stuff like that since I don't know, the Works Project Administration in the 1930s, in the depths of the last Great Depression, which is not wholly dissimilar to what we're going through now in the COVID world. But again, I digress. Let me get back to the script. I apologize for that, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, admittedly, we talked about the fact that numbers aren't so precise at the CCC, but there's been huge growth there. We've all been able to see it. And in order to feed that kind of development, enormous amounts of resources like coal, iron ore, crude, copper, edible oil, grains had to be procured from the four corners of the earth. CCP policy was to provide, and this is how they would sort of co-opt the suppliers or providers or the sources of the kinds of resources we're talking about. I mean, when you look at these cities, when you look at the infrastructure that they've been able to establish and create and install in the unbelievable time they did, you can just only imagine the amounts of iron ore and concrete and just mind-boggling the quantities of raw materials that it took to build modern day China. And they would often establish themselves in places where this is a palm oil plantation somewhere in Indonesia. This is a giant open pit mine. I forget what resource it is. I think it could be coal as far as I recall, judging from the blackness. But and this, of course, is a liquid natural gas. This is the obvious giant ore train coming out of central Australia, bound for the marine port on the coast. Subway systems. The idea is that in this, they would provide or sell infrastructure, and that provide or sell meaning either allow them to borrow from the Chinese government in order to, provided they use Chinese construction firms, etc., to build the roads or the clinic or the railroad or the mine or the liquid natural gas offloading center, whatever the case may have been, in exchange for guaranteed access to those very resources. So ports, transport, hydropower, water control, and supply was set up throughout Asia and Africa, and they even have a foothold in southern Europe. They have some arrangement in Italy, and they have lots of outposts in South America. So this policy has been branded under the new leader for life, Xi, as the Belt and Road policy. And let me just make one important brief but important note about Prime Minister Xi. Xi is the first prime minister since Mao Zedong, who ruled the Chinese Communist Party from the 30s until statehood in 49, and then from 49 till his death in 75. So what is that? That's 35 years at least as the head of state. And of course, he became wildly, corrupted and some say even insane. Certainly, in terms of his megalomania and his amazing appetite for, murder, he certainly became, outstanding in his brutality. Anyway, she's the first, and so one of the reforms that Deng installed, beside freeing up the market orientation of the average Chinese, was to put term limits on the premiership. And like clockwork, since Deng, every 10 years, these people retire and the next person is elected, or however that works. I doubt it's any sort of democratic election, but there's some sort of rubber stamp power broking that goes on in the Communist Party, the Politburo, the Standing Committee, whatever they call that stuff. They choose their own leadership. Of course, it's a one-party state. The people have no vote. So it doesn't really matter what the mechanism of how they choose their leadership is. They choose some new guy, and that was it. Every 10 years he turned over, and it made for a certain stability. Well, those days are over now because Xi is now the president for life. He's got his own sort of Xi thought, like Mao had thought. They had Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought, and now they have Xi thought. Anyway, this Belt and Road policy is the idea of connecting China and the rest of the world in a continuous movement of goods and services along roads they build, ports, deep water ports that they dredge and equip, overland rail systems, even high-speed commuter transportation systems. They in my lifetime, which is as I say, 62 years long, they have gone from being like I say, a country where they have all those black bicycles. I think they look like 3-speed or no speed bicycles to me, but they weren't anything fancy, that's for sure. To having I don't know, 27,000 kilometers. I think it's 27,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. More than all of Europe, more than anybody, any other country in the world, more than all of Europe put together. It's unbelievable. Among many other enormous infrastructure projects. So they want to sort of, they managed to acquire and implement the abilities to build such things. And as all good capitalists know, the real money is after you get the first one done in your country, we've overcharged your locals, 30%. Now you offer at competitive rates outside your country, and you're so experienced and so exercised in keeping the costs low, you can become a major competitor in world fair markets. Um, Now, just this week, in fact, just the end of last week, I should say, um, I'm getting ahead of myself actually, so let me not do that at the moment. Getting back to the, again, we're still trying to fill in some of the background, the important background we need to know concerning China and its history and relations, because these things are going to definitely come up in the near future. They're already coming up now. Part of the difficulties China suffered in the 19th to 20th centuries were the partial, though substantial, occupation of its territories and enslavement of its population. Yes, by the vicious and domineering Japanese, for whom the Chinese hold very little affection for. Since gaining power and prestige, the CCP is focused on maintaining and being seen to maintain significant military force to prevent such humiliations occurring. Again, it does this by keeping small but occasionally intense border disputes alive. This is an ancient Chinese tactic still in use today. As China gains power, this tactic becomes more forceful and thus more irritating to CCP neighbors. The Paracel and Spratly Islands, the Shisha, the Nansha, respectively, in Chinese islands, are the best example. This dispute has been going on even before I was born. It's been on since forever. The Paracel and the Spratlys are a textbook example of this kind of a strategic neighborly or unneighborly approach that China employs, and the Spratlys and the Paracel Islands are paradigmatic for this kind of business. These are a long contended possession of the Chinese state, but the Chinese Communist Party has built these remote volcanic rock piles, which is all they ever were, into major mid-South China Sea naval air bases. They've transformed in a matter of 5 years. They took what really were, volcanic rock piles. I don't know, maybe some turtles lived there, or I don't know, sea creatures, but you couldn't land a plane. You couldn't even board a landing party. There was nothing to land on. It was jagged rocks. Well, that's history. The Paracels and the Spratlys, and among many other even smaller chains, little piles in the South China Sea, are the home of large air bases, heavily armed naval air stations, and yes, recently there was an altercation between Indian and Chinese troops on one of the many points of disputed border territory in June, just of this year, a few weeks ago. And well, I won't go into the details, but they're quite brutal. And suffice to say that there were tens of casualties on both sides, and no shots were fired. I'll leave that to your imagination without further commentary. Now, I just do want to mention that, in general, as a student of Chinese, history and diplomatic affairs, that this tactic of these endless sort of border disputes just to keep the neighbors on their back feet should not be confused with a policy of having extraterritorial ambitions. China has none. They're not looking to take over Japan. They're not the Japanese lunatics of the 1930s and 40s. In fact, they've never been able to fully, more than a couple of centuries in a row, ever manage to manage their own real estate. It's such an enormously densely populated and rugged terrain nation that it's amazing they even exist at all. So the fact that they're generally recognized, and they have not demonstrated any real serious interest in taking over anything, except like these rock piles in the middle of the South China Sea. As the economy of the Chinese Communist Party progressed, so did its stature in the world community. China was an original member of the UN. It joined the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Court of Justice, which is what we see here. This is the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations. This is the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the ICJ in The Hague. Now, this is sort of an interesting rub, and this is true and needs to be given its due weight. While China was a member of all these rules-based organizations around the world, China is of the opinion that the system is stacked in favor of the United States, which it is, by the way. There's no real argument about that. These institutions, well, most of them anyway, were created in the aftermath of prior to the immediate end of the Second World War. So yes, the Americans dominated it because they were the only game in town, sort of. The Russians weren't calling the shots, and nobody was listening to them at that time. Anyway, so the Communist Party has always felt that in order to participate in this global system, they had to obtain any advantage they could, often with little regard for the rules of the game. And Exhibit 1 again is that really manipulative requirement that if you want to build Buicks in Shanghai, well, we want to know we want all the blueprints to the frame of that car, to the engine and valve system and carburation system and fuel injection, et cetera, for that all the vehicles you're going to produce here. Okay, great. Well, that's certainly a violation of the WT rules, and the fact that the current U.S. administration doesn't really care about using the dispute arbitration mechanism at the World Trade Organization and prefers rather just to strong-arm China in response to China's strong-arming of South. We'll leave that aside for the moment. But while this sort of strong-arm Chinese tactic was tolerated by the corporations who could not resist the market possibilities in modern China, corporate America, now holding on to the apron strings of the current U.S. administration, now they push back against China's strong-arm tactics. Now that they have a president willing to confront, who's a confrontational president and likes to be seen to be tough and standing up to the Chinese. So now these corporations are feeling very slighted and very abused, and that's not the true picture at all. But such is the state of affairs in current international political economy. And there's just one more bone of contention between the contending behemoth economies, and that is the treatment of many Chinese citizens at the hands of their own CCP, like the Uyghurs or Hong Kongers or anybody else, anybody expressing themselves and displeasing the CCP. It's a legitimate claim, and the U.S. does not hesitate to bring this matter up almost in any forum. Of course, to the deep annoyance of the CCP leadership. The outspokenness likely does none of the victims of CCP heavy-handedness any good, but it definitely raises Sino-American tensions. So you can see, I mean, these are Hong Kong citizens. Look at them. They look like, I don't know what they look like. They look like they work in the paint spraying department at Airbus when Airbus used to make planes. Or I don't know, chemical workers. Look at them. Do these people look like they're about to capitulate to the Chinese Communist Party? That's right. The answer is definitely no. Now, before examining the trade opportunities presented by this overt competition for leadership in the modern world, which is what this is, let's make no mistake about that. The Chinese do view the world as it currently, or as it previously was configured before the end of the Pacific Partnership talks and the American withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Americans have left a huge vacuum into which the Chinese have driven, a monster vehicle right through, in terms of this Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of a different sort of soft power, not like American soft power, American soft power with Chinese characteristics, perhaps as Xi thought would characterize the policy. But whatever you want to call it, this is a competition for the hearts and minds of the citizenry and the leadership, particularly, of many modern Western uh, uh, political capitalist democracies. Some more veteran, others more neophyte in their democratic experiences. But nonetheless, the Chinese are making direct and lavish appeals to many of these nations with a lot of cash and a lot of goodies that appeal to people, like ports and infrastructure and power generation and things that the Chinese Communist Party are in a position to provide to people who are compliant with the Chinese Communist Party's overall plan. So let's just review the to summarize the salient facts before, because they are likely to play out. Oh, excuse me, one moment, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize. Um, um, let us summarize the most salient facts because they are likely to play out in the coming years, and that is surely going to be true. They're playing out now. The Chinese Communist Party has developed its economy to be the second largest. It's now the United States, China, the EU, which is a trading bloc after all, followed by Japan. Was it Japan or the EU? I've forgotten momentarily. I believe Japan is number 3 and the EU is 4, but I could be wrong about that. But it's either 3 or 4. One of them, that's the only difference. U.S. is number 1, China is number 2. China's joined the world by being a member of many of the most influential, important world groupings. China has the need to prove to itself that it is a modern incarnation of the leading role China played on the world stage for centuries upon centuries. And this is, any student of Chinese history, and I don't say that term lightly, because being a student of Chinese history, it's like being a student of U.S. history of all, 275 years, This is thousands of years of diplomatic, political, economic, military history that it's not so easy to master. But that being said, just a brief reading of Chinese history makes it clear that the Chinese are very eager to regain that esteemed role on the world stage, and as a result of that eagerness, friction has developed between the United States and China because of the way China plays the quote rules-based trading game. In our opinion, there is significant credibility to that claim. Now, the U.S. administration is determined to take the CCP down a peg, at the least impede CCP progress toward its goal. Just a couple of weeks ago, the very end of June, the U.S. government forbade the sale, basically the entire sale entirely, of advanced United States microprocessors, Intel type stuff, Texas Instruments type stuff, high-end microprocessors to China, pretty much writ large. It's allegedly under the guise of not selling them to enablers of the Chinese, the Red Army, the People's Liberation Army. But that's a ridiculous notion, since they are huge players in the economy at large, and as a state-run entity, the whole thing is it's all state-run. There's no distinction between the People's Liberation Army or People's, Siloon Tire Plant 653 or anything of the sort. This is a state-run, monopolistic, largely command economy in the guise of some version of capitalism. So the conflict has caused rhetoric to flare, and it really has, and costs to be imposed. And these costs are real. You need a whole scorecard now to keep abreast of what tariffs are in place and what tariffs have been raised and lowered and waived and enforced and not enforced. It's a lawyer's fantasy, and the sides are reducing cooperation everywhere as a result of the COVID outbreak. The U.S. withdrew its funding and its membership, its participation in the World Health Organization. Thereby, of course, shooting themselves in their own foot, because it allowed China to sort of promulgate its own sensibilities and sell its own narrative, if you will, despite our lack of affection for that term, to sell its own story about how well they're managing and sort of get their standards to be adopted, because after all, and this is a true statement, the formerly most respected Center for Disease Control on Earth, the United States Center for Disease Control, has been gutted by the U.S. administration, and is a shadow of its former self, and really has very little regard anywhere any longer. Certainly on the subject of its actual name. So a great deal of uncertainty and fear, and this is probably the most important takeaway from this history section, is that a great deal of uncertainty and fear have been caused by the conflict between these two nations. Market volatility is tremendous. And this is why that may come as a surprise. The pandemic is being used as an opportunity to take advantage by the CCP in the race out of the economic seizure that overtook the world. And if you don't believe that, there's so much evidence to support it. Let me just cite you one case in particular. I guess no, I'm getting ahead of my own presentation. I can tell you, here it is coming up right now. Yes, I'll get to that question in a moment. And yours too, Barbara. Just be a little patient. We're going to cover that in a moment, and perhaps I'll even answer it in the midst of the conversation. The arenas in which in this competition for leadership and dominance of the modern international system are clear. That is, of course, assuming the competition is managed without resort to arms. And I'm afraid we have to point out that this is not a foregone conclusion, and hence that uncertainty and fear I mentioned in the previous slide. And I don't want to dwell on this, but we're adults here, and this is serious business, and our money is at stake, and foreign exchange traders have to be pretty aware of some of this business. The last time we saw anything this bad was the precursor to the Second World War. Now, the reason for the reasons are all different. This is not a man-made, man-induced phenomena. The world economy was admittedly for over 10 years humming along, maybe slowing up, gaining speed, getting tired, resting, but it was more or less growing very nicely, thank you very much. That came to an end with the arrival of COVID-19. We are of the opinion, and we've seen this opinion shared by others in the commentary that the Chinese are taking advantage of the fact that they were the first, what do you call it, in a market? I forgot the term. The first person to come up with an idea that's in the marketplace. That they're seeking to exploit that first person advantage, first comer advantage, provider advantage, which often, by the way, is exploited by the number two, who exploits the weaknesses that number one exposed to the world and removes them or controls them and overcomes the first in the field. But that's another story. The Chinese don't want that to happen, and so they are certainly goosing the numbers. The Chinese statistics, particularly the ones on the virus, are notoriously nonsensical and not taken very seriously. But as a propaganda tool, when there's in a world of lots of misinformation and disinformation and social nonsensical information and fake whatever it is, you can be sure that they are seeking to take advantage. In fact, I'll give you a recent example. Just the beginning of this month, the Chinese Communist Securities Regulator has given, or at least shown its propensity to allow certain of the big lenders in China, the big state-owned banks, to become investment banks. And this is going to directly confront or compete with, let's not say confront, we don't want to sound too confrontational, despite the fact, by the way, that there are 3 U.S. carrier strike groups in the South China Sea, 3 carrier strike groups. I've been monitoring the naval fleet for decades, and I don't recall the last time, maybe since the Vietnam War, we had that kind of firepower in the Eastern Pacific. The Western Pacific, pardon me, the Western Pacific. But the tradable assets. Let's talk about the tradable assets that are definitely in play. If you're interested in particular companies, Chinese and U.S. firms directly affected by a tariff or a sanction, of course, Huawei comes to mind, Alibaba comes to mind, Baidu, Walmart, Amazon, Walmart and Amazon, particularly because so much of their inventory is sourced in China. Intel, for other very complicated reasons, Intel makes those chips that are now under sanction if they're sold to China. But did someone mention anywhere that Intel makes a huge amount of its profits from sales to China? So naturally they're going to have to be funneled or reimbursed or indemnified or somehow paid off to go along with this. So those are individual stocks, and there are many more. In the case of, well, we'll get to there are a few other stocks. Now the currency devaluations, and as FX traders, this is really the crux of what we're interested in. What the currencies that are devaluations can be weapons in this arena of competition, and those weapons are principally lowering or devaluing the currency versus your opponent, so that if it costs less of your opponent's currency to buy the same amount of your currency, thereby making your goods that are purchased by your opponent cheaper, you'll do it. And there's tons and tons of evidence for that repeatedly since the end of the Second World War and the Bretton Woods Agreement, and even once the Bretton Woods Agreement falls apart in '71 when Nixon says sayonara to that proposition, and we go into what's called the free-floating system, which is what we have today, where currencies readjust in real time on a constant basis around the world, 23.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. 5.5 days a week, something like that. So there's a lot. There's the U.S. dollar versus the Hong Kong dollar. The Hong Kong dollar is in play because Hong Kong is one of those places that the Chinese Communist Party seeks to squeeze and to manipulate and to control. The yen is directly related to anything Chinese because of the amount of business done between Japan and China. They're as big a partners with China, well, proportionally anyway, to their economy, as the U.S. is. The Chinese yuan and the Hong Kong dollar, that's an obvious trade. It's a direct play on, it's a direct position on how you feel the Hong Kong citizens are going to come out. That's as simple as we can state it. And that's a very popular trade among many traders. And if you take a look at the chart, you'll see that it's been fairly reliable. Aussie yen, of course, because these are all parts of the China, or related directly to the Chinese Belt and Road, if you will, a system of supply and procurement for the Chinese economy. And stock indices are crucial monitors of fear and panic. When there's a little panic, these indices are very reactive, and they're highly volatile, and therefore offer wide movements. And for those of you who trade, that's pretty much the welcome wagon sign for profitable trading. Commodities prices is also sensitive to trade panic, which is what this competition between the CCP and the United States is. It's panic related to trade, and energies, materials, food as well. These also react quite quickly to tensions that play out on this level of the world economic stage. So we have Baidu, Alibaba, the S&P 500, the Chinese yuan. That's actually the Chinese renminbi. There's plenty of forex activity here. Dollar HKD, dollar yuan, dollar yen, yuan HKD, and the Aussie yen, and probably more actually. But those are the major ones that we've been tracking and trading here at our shop. And just unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the historical part. We're going to get to the end game in a moment, but it's important. This is a complex part of the world, and the background does take a little time. So thank you for bearing with us. As if the pandemic and a Cold War between powerful rivals weren't enough risk, there is one more risk in the deck, and it's political, and it's the U.S. presidential race. Despite the decline and simultaneous rise of China on the world stage, the U.S. administration still packs a lot of heft in many realms. We are of the opinion that there are three likely outcomes to the U.S. presidential election. And we call them A, B, and C. A, which we give a 62.25% probability to. So this, in our opinion, it's 2/3 likely that President Trump will win, and that once he's reelected, he's going to back off. He'll see it lessen his interests to be argumentative and provocative. He'll cool down. And so there'll be continued friction, but it'll be tension that's manageable. There'll be a lot of noise and sparks, but no real danger. The yuan, the continuing weak yuan will be tolerated. The U.S. dollar will pretty much maintain its stability, assuming that there's low inflation, and that's a big if, because of the monetary largesse, which has been slathered onto the economies of the world. I mean, and I don't mean to be facetious. That there's no doubt that that's what was called for, and it was well placed, and I don't really want to take issue with that. But inflation is likely to ensue. And if it does, the U.S. will devalue its dollar. The second probability is that Biden wins, and we give that only a 1 out of 4 possibility. But should that happen, Democrats will return to a multilateralist approach, the drawbridge down approach, welcome, not closed, a strong dollar, an increase in global trade, and an increase, a return to sort of more healthy GDP growth, less sniping at each other, more economic and planetary environmental cooperation. The yuan might even strengthen, and the yen will weaken, because the yen is strengthened quite significantly out of this tension of the last, we'll call it 3 years, I guess. And it'll probably give back some of its strength as well, much to the delight of its own exporters. To the delight of Toyota and Nissan and Nikon and the thousands of fabulous Japanese manufacturers. And then the final outcome, which we view as really only about a 1 out of 12.5% probability, is that President Trump wins and dials it up. And that's going to have open currency warfare via high inflation and deflation, because the two competitors will be slashing their currency values, as we saw between the world wars. Huge inflation in Weimar Germany and National Socialist Germany until it was brought under control under the fascists. The yuan will weaken, the Hong Kong dollar will weaken, and so will the Aussie. And that's the way we see it. So look, we have the assets we've talked about, and that's particularly the Hong Kong dollar, of course, the U.S. dollar versus the Hong Kong dollar, the greenback versus the yuan, the greenback versus the yen, the yuan versus the Hong Kong dollar, the Aussie versus the yen. The indexes are all going to be very, very responsive. We've got the ASX in Australia. We've got the Nikkei. There are many, many possibilities to trade. The extreme nervousness and shakes that we're seeing by traders all around the world, and the volatility is so high that it makes there's risk in this. Nothing is sure, but for those of us those of you who've been able to hold your nerve and hold on to these positions, like we say, it's been business has been pretty good of late. So that's the end of our formal presentation. Let me open the floor to some questions. Feel free. Yes. Well, Barbara, your question I did answer, but Bruce's question about Bruce asked, what do you think is the possibility that the CCP will return to a rules-based system? I think the possibility, first of all, I don't know. I mean, it's a great question, Bruce, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you this, that should the U.S. come back to its Westphalian senses, if you will, and return to a rules-based, sort of what do they call it? Level playing field, negotiated arrangement of international relationships, the Chinese are likely to play ball and line up sooner or later. It'll be tough going. They're not easily cowed, but I think they could be brought to heel at some point. Now, and again, we only assess that probability at 1 out of 4. We only give Biden a chance of winning at 25%. Assuming that the president gets reelected and he dials it down, and then it's a matter of will he return to a multilateral negotiations? I have no idea. My guess is not likely because they don't have the kind of intellectual horsepower to drive an effort like that. They just wouldn't be able to get their heads around, and the Chinese would take tremendous advantage of them, so they wouldn't expose themselves to that. So they would probably prefer to, the old, take your toys out of the sandbox and leave gambit, which is what they've pretty much been up to the last 4 years. So that's my answer to you, Bruce. Yeah. Omar asks, under what... Oh, yes, I see. I'm sorry. My mistake, Omar. I couldn't read. I couldn't understand. Omar asks, under what condition would the Hong Kong dollar strengthen? Wow. You guys are serious today. The Hong Kong dollar would strengthen in the event that the Chinese Communist Party backed down. Okay? You tell me what the probability of that is. Again, having no crystal ball here at Traders Brief, the Traders Brief, Sino-American rivalry brief just doesn't really have definitive data there. But should the Chinese Communist Party grant concessions to the Hong Kong citizens, and I mean that could be stated many ways, should the Chinese Communist Party see fit to grant the Chinese citizenry more representation on that sort of puppet rubber stamp council that they have in Hong Kong, it's another possibility. But should any one of a multitude of different outcomes occur that make it clear that the Chinese citizens have I should say the Hong Kongers have wrested gains of freedom, political freedom from the Chinese Communist Party, the Hong Kong dollar will strengthen and the Chinese yuan will definitely weaken. Because, the Hong Kong dollar will strengthen because the perpetuation of Hong Kong independence, and particularly financial and jurisprudential freedom. In other words, people are confident about investing money in China through Hong Kong because you can be sure if there's a dispute in Hong Kong, you'll have a reasonable chance of getting a fair hearing and a transparent undertaking, which is, of course, not the case in CCP land. So that's how I see it, Omar. It's a long shot, but that's the best I can do. Sure, my pleasure, sir. So, ladies and gentlemen, I see we're approaching an hour here, and that's about as long as I want to go. Let me thank you on behalf of the Trade On 2020 convention, and I am Seth Julian for Traders Brief. Thank you for joining us, and trade with confidence, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.